The flash was silent. A blinding white light that erased 189 souls in an instant. One moment I was planning the rest of my life at 35,000 feet. The next, I was falling through the dark, strapped to a single seat as the world screamed past me. They call me the Amazon Miracle, the man who survived a mid-air explosion. But they don't know the truth. My survival wasn't a miracle. It was a statistical error. And the real story isn't about how I lived. It's about the curse of being the only one who did. This story comes from the most remote corner of the planet. Before I take you there, I want to see how far it can travel. Take a second and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. An hour before my world ended, it had never felt more perfect. The cabin was quiet, bathed in the soft blue glow of the overhead lights. Most passengers were asleep, their faces peaceful and anonymous in the dimness. The only sound was the steady, reassuring hum of the engines, a gentle promise that we were all being carried safely through the night sky. I wasn't tired. I was electric. On the tablet screen resting on my lap, I scrolled through the pages of a contract I knew by heart. My finger traced over the final line, over a digital signature that represented 2 years of relentless work. It was done. The deal that would define my career, that would build the foundation for my entire future, was finally closed. I leaned my head back against the cool window, a slow smile spreading across my face. All my life I had been a planner. Every step was calculated, every risk assessed. I built my life like an architect designs a building, ensuring every beam was secure, every angle was perfect, and it had worked. At 28 years old, I had achieved the impossible. I pulled out my phone, knowing the Wi-Fi was spotty, but I had to tell her. I typed out a short message to my fiancée, Chloe. We did it. The life we dreamed of starts now. The message took a moment. Then the little checkmark appeared. Delivered. I pictured her waking up to that message in the morning, her smile lighting up the room. We could finally buy the house we'd been looking at, the one with the big backyard for the dog we hadn't even adopted yet. We could finally set a wedding date. All the pieces were falling into place exactly as I had planned. The flight attendant walked past, her movements calm and practiced. I asked for a ginger ale, the bubbles a small fizzy celebration in the quiet cabin. She handed it to me with a polite smile, and I felt a sense of profound peace. Everything was in its right place. I was suspended between my past and a perfect future, in a perfectly engineered machine, soaring miles above a world I had, for all intents and purposes, conquered. I took a sip of my drink and looked out the window. Below us was just an endless, inky blackness, the Amazon, a vast, sleeping wilderness that held no interest for me. My world was up here, in the clean, controlled, predictable environment of the cabin. I was safe. I was successful. I was on my way home. Nothing could go wrong. There was no warning, no turbulence, no flicker of the lights, no nervous announcement from the cockpit. 1 second, the hum of the engines was a lullaby. The next, the universe tore itself apart. It started with the light, a flash from outside my window, so impossibly bright it felt like staring into the sun. It wasn't yellow or orange like a fire. It was a pure, sterile, silent white that bleached all color from the world. For a fraction of a second, I saw the face of the man across the aisle, his mouth open in a perfect O of surprise, his skin illuminated like an X-ray. Then came the sound. It wasn't an explosion in the way you hear in movies. It was a physical concussion, a deep, guttural roar of metal screaming as it failed. It was the sound of a giant hand crushing our aluminum tube, a noise that vibrated through my bones and rattled my teeth. It was the sound of physics giving up. Instantly the air was gone, ripped from the cabin from my lungs in a violent, greedy gasp. My ears popped with excruciating pain. A thick, icy fog erupted from nowhere, filling the cabin and obscuring everything in a swirling, ghostly mist. The temperature plummeted, and the cold was a physical shock, like being plunged into a frozen lake. Papers, blankets, and small bags became projectiles, whipping through the fog-filled air with lethal speed. The serene, orderly cabin of a moment ago had become a vortex of chaos. I couldn't breathe. My chest burned, and my mind, my perfectly logical planning mind, could not form a single coherent thought. There was no time for fear. There was only the raw, animal instinct of a creature trapped in a collapsing cage. My hands gripped the armrests with a force that felt like it would shatter the plastic. The plane lurched violently, not down but sideways, as if swatted from the sky. The force was incredible, pinning me to my seat. I could hear screams now, but they were thin and distant, swallowed by the deafening roar of the wind. The structure of the aircraft groaned around us, the death rattle of a dying beast. I turned my head, trying to see, trying to understand. Through the swirling mist, I saw a jagged crack of night sky appear in the ceiling of the plane. It spiderwebbed in an instant, a black, star-filled wound in the fuselage. The crack widened and the metal peeled back like a lid on a can. The perfect machine was gone. We were no longer in an airplane. We were in a broken thing, a collection of parts falling apart at the edge of space. My section of the plane was being torn away. I felt a horrifying lurch, a final, definitive separation. The floor beneath my feet trembled and then simply gave way. The hum of the engines was replaced by the pure, undiluted scream of the wind. And the man I saw across the aisle just a second ago was no longer there. His seat. And everything around it was just empty. Black sky. The floor was gone. The sky was everywhere. My section of the plane, 3 seats and a jagged piece of the fuselage, was untethered from the world. We were a broken fragment, a piece of a forgotten world, and we were falling. The first few seconds were a strange, horrifying ballet, a sense of weightlessness, a cosmic stillness as we reached the apex of our trajectory, momentarily hanging in the void between the explosion and the pull of gravity. For a single crystal-clear moment, I saw the stars above me, cold and indifferent, more brilliant than I had ever seen them. There was no wind, no sound, just a profound, terrifying silence. Then gravity took hold. We began to plummet. The piece of wreckage started to tumble, end over end, and the world became a nauseating blender of black sky and pinprick stars. The wind returned, not as a roar, but as a physical entity, a solid wall of air that tore at my clothes and tried to rip the breath from my body. The cold was a living thing, seeping into my bones, a deep, absolute cold that felt like the grave. My mind, the planner's mind, tried to calculate. How fast? How long? It was useless. There was no frame of reference, no up or down. I was strapped into a carnival ride designed by hell itself, spinning through an infinite abyss. The seatbelt was the only thing keeping me anchored to reality, its straps digging into my chest and hips with brutal force, the one sensation that told me I was still a physical being. I closed my eyes, but it made no difference. The darkness was absolute, both inside and out. The screams I'd heard earlier were gone, replaced by the singular, monotonous shriek of our descent. Was I screaming? I couldn't tell. My own voice was lost in the chaos. This is it. The thought finally broke through the static. Not a panicked cry, but a dull, empty statement of fact. This is the end of the plan. I thought of Chloe. Her face, her smile, her name formed on my lips, but the wind stole it before it could become a sound. I'm sorry. The tumbling seemed to slow, stabilizing into a more direct, terrifying plunge. The shriek of the wind changed its pitch, growing deeper, angrier, and for the first time, I realized the darkness below me wasn't empty. It was a different kind of black, a solid, textured blackness that was rushing up to meet me at an impossible speed. The jungle. The canopy reached up like skeletal hands. There was a sudden, violent crack, like a rifle shot next to my ear, as the edge of our wreckage clipped the top of a colossal tree. The structure shuddered, and I was thrown forward against the straps. Then another crack, louder this time. The sound of ancient wood splintering, of nature being violently torn apart. We were no longer just falling. We were crashing through a forest from above. Branches, thick as my body, whipped past me, shredding the metal around my seat. Leaves and splinters filled the air. The descent became a series of brutal, bone-jarring impacts, each one a miniature car crash, each one slowing us just enough to prolong the agony. The sound was a deafening, percussive symphony of destruction. I saw a final, massive branch coming directly towards me. I didn't even have time to brace myself. The world didn't go black. It exploded into a supernova of pain, a white-hot flash behind my eyes. I felt a force so unimaginable it seemed to pass through my body and into my very soul. A shockwave that felt like every bone was breaking at once, It wasn't a collision, it was a cessation of existence. And then nothing. Pain was first. A white-hot, searing agony in my left leg that cut through the fog of unconsciousness. It wasn't a dull ache. It was a sharp, insistent scream that radiated up my entire body. It was the only thing in the universe. For a moment, I was nothing but that pain. Then came the rain. A cool, gentle drizzle on my face, each drop a tiny shock against my skin. It was real. Tangible. My breathing followed, a ragged, shallow gasp that shuddered through my chest. The air tasted thick, heavy with the smell of wet earth, of something metallic and oily, and underneath it all the sweet, cloying scent of decay. Jet fuel and jungle. An impossible combination. My eyes fluttered open. The world was a blurry, vertical smear of green and brown. I was lying on my back, looking straight up. High above, a dense canopy of leaves formed a ceiling, a kind of shattered, stained glass window through which a dim grey light filtered, a cathedral of green. I was pinned. My right shoulder was wedged hard against the twisted frame of my seat. My head was tilted at an awkward angle, pressed against a cold, damp piece of metal. I tried to move, and the pain in my leg exploded into a nova, forcing a raw cry from my throat. I forced myself to look down. The sight didn't register at first. My brain simply refused to process it. My dark business slacks were shredded and soaked in a deeper black that I knew was my own blood. And protruding from my thigh, just above the knee, was a piece of wood. A branch, jagged and thick, had punched through the wreckage and through my leg, pinning me to the forest floor. A piece of the forest had claimed a piece of me. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced the shock. I started to struggle, a frantic, useless thrashing that only made the pain worse. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild drumbeat in the suffocating. Silence. Silence. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The roaring wind, the screaming metal, the splintering trees, it was all gone, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a pressure against my eardrums. The only sounds were the soft patter of the rain and my own panicked breathing. I twisted my neck, ignoring the protesting muscles, and took in my surroundings. I was in a small, dark clearing, surrounded by the colossal trunks of trees that rose like the pillars of an ancient temple. The ground was a carpet of mud and damp leaves, and scattered all around me, glinting dully in the gloom, were pieces of the plane. Not large pieces. There was no tail section, no cockpit, just small, shredded fragments of metal, wiring and insulation. I saw a single intact tray table, a blue carry-on bag ripped open, its contents spilled into the mud, a single white sneaker, sitting upright, as if its owner had just stepped out of it. Confetti from a forgotten life. My row of 3 seats was the largest piece of wreckage in sight, a mangled island of blue fabric and twisted aluminum. The 2 seats beside me were empty. The seatbelts were still buckled. I was the only one. Hello? The word was a croak, barely audible. I cleared my throat, tasting blood. I took a deeper breath, wincing as my ribs protested. Hello, I screamed, putting every ounce of my strength into it. Is anyone there? My voice echoed for a second, a thin, pathetic sound that was swallowed by the immense, indifferent wilderness. And the only thing that answered was the rain. The silence that answered my scream was more terrifying than any noise. It was a declaration, a verdict. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The panic receded, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp focus. The planner, the problem solver who had been buried under an avalanche of shock, clawed its way back to the surface. Crying for help was an appeal to a world that no longer existed. Lying here, pinned, and bleeding was a death sentence. Problem number 1, I am trapped. I reached for the seatbelt buckle. My fingers were numb and clumsy, fumbling with the familiar mechanism. It was jammed. I pulled again, gritting my teeth, my muscles screaming in protest. With a loud click, it finally released. The straps went slack, and for the first time, I felt a sliver of freedom. Problem number 2, the branch. I could feel its rough bark through the shredded fabric of my pants. It was an anchor, holding me to this spot. Pulling it out was not an option. My analytical mind, even in its shattered state, knew that the branch was likely the only thing keeping me from bleeding out. It was both the wound and the plug. I had to break it. Propping myself up on my elbows, I ignored the symphony of pain from my leg, my ribs, my shoulder. I gripped the thick piece of wood where it entered my thigh. It was slick with rain and blood. My other hand grabbed the section of the branch extending out the other side of the wreckage. I had to snap the part that was outside the metal, freeing my leg from the debris. I took a deep, shuddering breath and pulled the two ends in opposite directions. The pain was blinding. A white light flashed behind my eyes, and a low, animalistic groan escaped my lips. The branch didn't budge. It was solid, living wood. I repositioned my grip, my vision swimming. Again. I pulled, roaring this time, channeling every ounce of adrenaline, fear, and rage into that single movement. The wood groaned. I felt a grinding friction vibrate up through my hands and into the bone of my leg. It was an unholy, sickening sensation. With a wet, cracking sound, the outer part of the branch snapped. A wave of nausea and blackness washed over me. I collapsed back into the mud, panting, my body trembling uncontrollably. I was free from the wreckage, but the price was a new kind of agony. A jagged, splintered stump of wood was now a permanent part of my body. Using my arms, I dragged myself away from the seats, leaving a dark trail in the mud. Every movement was a negotiation with pain. After a few feet, I stopped, exhausted, my forehead pressed against the cool, damp earth. I had to find them. I forced myself up, leaning heavily on the trunk of a massive tree. The search began. It was a slow, agonizing limp through the small clearing. I called out again, my voice hoarse and weak. "Hello? Please? Anyone?" I moved from one piece of debris to the next. I found a copy of a Sky Mall magazine, its pages impossibly pristine. I found a single leather glove. I found a child's drawing, its crayon colors bleeding in the rain, a smiling sun in the corner of the page. Each item was a ghost, a whisper of a life that had been extinguished in a flash of light. There were no bodies, no other large pieces of the plane, just these small, scattered remnants, like the universe had tried to erase us and hadn't quite swept up all the pieces. The rain began to fall harder, washing the world clean. It ran down my face, mixing with the sweat and grime. I finally understood. The explosion hadn't just broken the plane apart, it had vaporized it. It had scattered it over miles of this impenetrable jungle. My small section of the fuselage hadn't been part of a crash. It had been a stray piece of shrapnel. The adrenaline was gone now, leaving behind a deep, shaking chill and a pain that was becoming a universe in itself. I sank to my knees in the mud, the search over. I wasn't just the only survivor in this clearing. The math of the fall, the violence of the explosion, the sheer impossible odds, it all added up to one soul-crushing conclusion. I was the only survivor, period. I wasn't saved. I was just the one who had been left behind, alone. The rain fell with a steady, impartial rhythm, washing the blood from my hands and turning the ground around me into a soupy, brown mire. I knelt there for a time I couldn't measure, the reality of my situation settling into my bones like the deep, pervasive cold. 189 people were gone. Their plans, their families, their quiet thoughts in the moments before the flash, all erased. And I was here, a broken man in a broken piece of jungle, left to witness the silence. A tremor started in my hands and spread through my entire body. It was shock, I knew, and the onset of hypothermia. If I stayed here, kneeling in the mud, the jungle wouldn't need a predator to finish me. The cold and the wet would do. It quietly and efficiently. Get up. The thought was a command from a distant part of my brain, the part that still believed in cause and effect, in action and survival. I used the trunk of a tree to haul myself upright again, my legs screaming a protest that almost sent me back to my knees. Each movement was a calculus of pain. I looked back at the mangled row of seats, the only piece of my old world that remained. It wasn't just wreckage, it was shelter. The journey back was a pathetic crawl. Dragged my wounded leg through the mud, my arms burning with the effort, leaving a furrow in the earth like some wounded animal. It probably took me 10 minutes to cross 30 feet. By the time I reached the seats, I was gasping, my vision dotted with black spots. The seats were wedged against the base of a thick, gnarled tree. I managed to pull a large, torn piece of the fuselage's inner lining free. It was a flimsy piece of plastic and insulation, but it was wide, shoving one end into the mud and propping the other against the back of the seats. I created a crude, sloping roof. It was a pathetic lean-to, barely large enough for me to squeeze under. I crawled into the small space, my back pressed against the damp fabric of the airline seats. The rain still found its way through the gaps, but it was no longer a deluge. It was a manageable drip. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. My thirst was a fire in my throat. My tongue felt thick and dry. I looked at the water pooling in the mud, and my stomach turned. My eyes scanned the debris field. I saw a curved piece of metal from the overhead bin, about the size of a dinner plate. I dragged myself back out, grabbed it, and positioned it on the ground, where the drips from my makeshift roof were heaviest. Drip, drip, drip. The sound was a form of torture, a slow promise of relief. As the grey light began to fade, the jungle changed. The steady sound of the rain was joined by a chorus of new noises. 1,000,000 insects began to chirp and buzz, a pulsating electric hum that filled the air. Strange bird-like calls echoed from the canopy, some like whistles, others like mocking laughter. I heard movement in the undergrowth, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig. The world was waking up and I was on the menu. Darkness fell like a curtain, swift and absolute. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The sounds grew louder, closer. Every rustle was a predator stalking me. Every strange call was a warning I couldn't understand. My planner's mind, the one that thrived on data and predictability, was now a prisoner in a world of terrifying unknowns. I was no longer a man. I was prey, hiding in a tiny, fragile shell, hoping the night would overlook me. The hours crawled by. Sleep was impossible. The pain in my leg had settled into a deep, rhythmic throb that synced with my own frantic heartbeat. The cold was relentless. I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering uncontrollably, my teeth chattering. My thoughts became a feverish loop. The flash of light, the fall, Chloe's face, the child's drawing in the mud. Sometime in the deepest, darkest hour of the night, I felt a change. The throb in my leg was sharpening, and a strange heat was spreading from the wound, a warmth that had nothing to do with the outside world. It was a fire starting deep within my own flesh. When the first faint hint of dawn finally broke through the canopy, painting the darkness in shades of grey, I gathered the strength to look at my leg. The skin around the jagged stump of the branch was no longer just bruised. It was swollen, taut, and an angry, dark red. And from the wound, dark lines were beginning to snake their way up my thigh, like the roots of a poisonous tree taking hold inside me. The red lines were a map of my own decay. The first day, they were faint whispers on my skin. By the second, they were angry, raised highways of poison, and the heat radiating from my leg was a furnace. The jungle had its roots in me, and it was pulling me down into the earth. Time dissolved. It ceased to be a series of days and nights, and became a blurry, repeating cycle of misery. There was the grey time and the black time. The grey time was a state of waking dread. I would drag myself out of my shelter to collect the pitiful amount of water that had gathered in the piece of metal overnight. It was never enough. It was a few sips of lukewarm, metallic-tasting liquid that did nothing to quench the fire in my throat, a fire stoked by the fever that now owned me. I would lie there, too weak to move, watching the relentless green world around me, feeling my life seep away into the mud. The black time was worse. It was a descent into a fever-dream hell. The symphony of the jungle at night was no longer just a collection of animal sounds. My burning mind twisted them, gave them meaning. The chirping of insects became a frantic, whispered chatter just on the edge of comprehension. The hoot of a distant creature became a mournful cry, a lament, and the wind was the worst. When it moved through the tattered remains of the fuselage, it created a low, whistling moan. And in that moan, I started to hear them. The voices. They were faint at first, like a radio tuned to a dead station, but as the fever tightened its grip, they became clearer. I heard the man who had been sitting across the aisle, asking the flight attendant for a blanket. I heard the soft laughter of a woman a few rows back. I heard the cry of a baby, a sound that sliced through the darkness and right into my soul. They weren't ghosts. They were echoes, memories replaying in the echo chamber of my skull, broadcast by the fever. Sometimes I would answer them. "I'm sorry," I'd whisper into the darkness, my body racked with shivers despite the heat raging inside me. "I'm so sorry." My mind began to play tricks in the grey time too. I'd see movement in my peripheral vision, a flicker of motion that would vanish when I turned to look. I saw faces in the patterns of moss on the tree trunks, their eyes wide, their mouths open in silent screams. They were always watching me, the jury of the dead. Why me? The question became a constant looping mantra in my head. Why was I the one piece of shrapnel that was allowed to land? There was no logic to it. It was a tear in the fabric of probability, a bug in the system. The planner in me couldn't accept it, and the man in me couldn't bear it. One afternoon, during a bout of shivering so violent I thought my bones would shake apart, I had the clearest vision of all. I saw Chloe standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the debris. She wasn't smiling. Her face was full of a profound, heartbreaking sadness. She just looked at me, a silent question in her eyes. "Why aren't you with me?" "I tried," I cried, the words cracking in my throat. "I'm trying." But she just shook her head slowly and faded back into the suffocating green. That's when I finally understood. This wasn't survival, this was a postponed death. I had been given a front-row seat to my own slow, agonizing end. The explosion had been the merciful exit. This was the punishment. The world called it a miracle, but they were wrong. It wasn't a miracle, it was my curse, to be the sole witness, the one left behind to remember the screams the wind now carried. I don't know what day it was, maybe the 5th, maybe the 10th, when the fever broke. It wasn't a gentle release. It was a violent shattering, a moment of cold, terrifying clarity that pierced through the hallucinatory fog. I woke from a dream of Chloe fading into the trees, and the despair was so absolute, so final, that it became a kind of fuel. I was going to die here. The infection was consuming me from the inside out. The jungle was waiting patiently for me to stop breathing. My ghosts were my only companions. This was the end of the story, unless I wrote a different ending. A single primal piece of logic surfaced from the wreckage of my mind. The planner's last desperate plan. Water. Water flows downhill. It gathers. It forms streams, then rivers. And people live near rivers. It was a gamble with odds so long they were effectively zero, but the odds of staying put were exactly zero. Then I heard it. Beneath the buzz of insects and the chatter of my ghosts, there was another sound. A faint, almost imperceptible trickle. It was so quiet, I was sure. It was another trick of the fever, but I listened, holding my breath, and there it was again. A gentle, liquid whisper. Hope is a dangerous, cruel thing. It hurts more than despair. But I clung to it. Getting to my feet was no longer an option. This journey would be made on my hands and knees. I began to crawl, dragging my useless, burning leg behind me. Every foot was a mountain. Roots clutched at my clothes. Thorns tore at my skin. I wasn't a man anymore. I was a wounded insect. A broken thing pulling itself through the dirt, drawn by a sound that might not even be real. The voices came with me. "You're leaving us," they seemed to whisper in the rustle of the leaves. "You don't get to leave." I ignored them. I focused on the sound. It grew steadily louder, from a trickle to a gurgle. I pushed through a curtain of thick, wet leaves and saw it. A small stream, no wider than my arm, carving a muddy path through the undergrowth. It was real. Tears I didn't know I had left streamed down my face. I plunged my hands into the cool, running water, the sensation a shock of life against my feverish skin. I drank, scooping handfuls of the muddy water into my mouth, not caring about the dirt or the risk. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever tasted. My new plan was simple: follow the water. I don't know how long I followed that stream. It might have been hours. It might have been an entire day. Time was a smear of grey and black, of crawling and collapsing, of delirium and that. One single guiding sound. The stream gradually widened, its voice growing from a whisper to a murmur. It was leading me somewhere. Eventually the undergrowth thinned, and I crawled onto a muddy bank. The stream was flowing into something much larger. A wide, brown, slow-moving river, the Amazon itself. It was vast, empty, and just as hopeless as the jungle I had left behind. I had reached the end of my plan, and there was nothing here. I collapsed onto the bank, my strength completely gone. This was it. I had traded one dying place for another. I closed my eyes, listening to the gentle lapping of the river, preparing for the end. And then I heard a new sound, a low, rhythmic thrumming. a mechanical sound. It was so alien in this world of natural noises that my brain immediately labeled it a hallucination. Another trick, but it didn't fade. It grew louder, a steady, guttural pulse that vibrated through the ground. With the last ounce of strength I possessed, I pushed myself up onto my elbows. My vision was a wavering tunnel. I blinked, trying to clear the fog, and I saw it, coming around a bend in the river. A boat, a long, battered wooden boat with a small, sputtering outboard motor. 2 men were in it. They were not ghosts. They were real, their skin weathered by the sun, their movements solid and purposeful. They hadn't seen me. They were looking at the opposite bank. I tried to shout. A dry, rasping hiss was all that came out. I tried to wave my arm, but it felt like it was made of stone. They were going to pass by. They were going to pass by, and I was going to die here on this riverbank within sight of salvation. No, I gathered everything. The pain, the guilt, the memory of the fall, the faces of the dead. I poured it all into one final desperate act. I pushed myself forward, rolling off the muddy bank and into the shallow, murky water at the river's edge. The shock of the water, the splash, the sudden movement, it was enough. I saw one of the men turn. His head, his eyes widened. He shouted something to the other man in a language I dimly recognized as Portuguese. The boat's engine cut, and it drifted towards me. Their faces were etched with a mixture of disbelief and horror. They were looking at a skeleton, a wild thing covered in mud and blood with a piece of wood sticking out of its leg. They were real. The relief was so total, so absolute, it extinguished the last spark of consciousness that had kept me alive. My vision dissolved into white, and the world finally, mercifully went black. Waking up was not a single event. It was a slow, fractured climb out of a deep, dark well, grasping at broken pieces of reality. There were flashes, the bumpy, rhythmic journey in the bottom of the wooden boat, the sky a dizzying, spinning blue above me, the face of one of the miners, his eyes wide with a kind of fearful reverence, the roar of a helicopter, its blades beating the air with a sound that felt both like salvation and a terrifying echo of the plane's failure. Then different sensations, the sterile antiseptic smell that replaces the smell of mud and decay, the prick of a needle in my arm, the impossible softness of a clean, dry sheet against my skin. Voices spoke in the gentle, rolling cadence of Portuguese, words I didn't understand but whose tones were professional, calm, and distant. When I finally opened my eyes to a world that stayed in focus, I was in a white room. A steady, electronic beep kept time, with my own heartbeat. A clear bag of fluid dripped life back into my veins. My leg was encased in a cage of metal and plaster, an external fixator that looked like a piece of industrial scaffolding. It was clean, white, and alien. The branch was gone. They had cut the jungle out of me, but I could still feel its phantom roots deep in my bone. A nurse was the first to notice I was awake. She called for a doctor. Soon, my room was a quiet storm of activity. They shone lights in my eyes. They asked me simple questions in broken English. Do you know your name? Alex Miller. Do you know where you are? A hospital. It was a nurse who first showed me the newspaper. She pointed to a picture of my own face on the front page, a haggard, wild-eyed photo taken on my arrival. Above it, a headline I didn't need a translator to understand. O Milagre da Amazonia, the Amazon miracle. That's when the second inferno began. My body was a prisoner in that bed, but the world outside rushed in. First came the officials from the embassy, then the airline investigators. They sat by my bedside with notepads and gentle voices, asking me to remember. Remember the sound. Remember the light. Remember the fall. I was no longer a person to them. I was a witness, a piece of evidence, the human black box. Then came Chloe. She flew in as soon as they found me. When she walked into my room, I saw the ghost she had seen in the jungle. Her face was a mask of relief, but her eyes were full of a horror she couldn't hide. She held my hand, she cried, she told me she loved me, but there was a chasm between us now, a vast, silent wilderness of experience that words couldn't cross. How could I explain the sound of the wind? How could I describe the voices in the rain? The world called me a miracle, so it demanded a story of hope. Reporters shouted questions from the hospital hallway. Television producers sent offers for interviews, for movies, for books. They wanted to package my pain into an Inspirational tale of human resilience. But every night when the hospital fell quiet, the jungle would return. I would close my eyes, and I wasn't in a bed. I was falling. I would feel the weightless spin, see the indifferent stars, and hear the screams of the other passengers, not as a memory, but as if it were happening all over again. I'd wake up shouting, my hands gripping the bedsheets, the steady beep of the heart monitor accelerating into a frantic alarm. The doctors called it PTSD. But that was just a label, a neat and tidy box for a chaos that had no name. It was the guilt, a crushing, suffocating weight. Why me? Why was I the one spared the clean, quick finality of the explosion? Why was I the one left to carry the memory of 189 silent goodbyes? The world celebrated a miracle, but I knew the truth. They hadn't rescued a man from the jungle. They had recovered a ghost, a statistical error who was cursed to walk the earth with the weight of an entire airplane full of souls on his back. It's been years now. I live in a small house where the land is flat and the trees are small and orderly. I can see the sky from every window, a wide, open, predictable sky. I never get on an airplane. The doctors fixed my body. The leg healed, leaving a thick, jagged scar that looks like a bolt of lightning etched into my skin. A permanent map of the place that tried to claim me. But the other wounds, the ones they couldn't see, never closed. There is the Alex who got on that plane. And there is the one who was found on the riverbank. They are not the same person. The first Alex was an architect of his own life, a man who believed in control, in plans, in the solid, reassuring logic of a well-laid path. He died somewhere in the fall, in that terrifying, weightless spin between the explosion and the trees. The man who lives now understands the truth. There is no plan. There is no control. There is only chaos and chance, and the silent, indifferent sky. Our lives are built on a thin, fragile crust, and we spend our days pretending it will never crack. People still call me the Amazon miracle. They use my story to reassure themselves. They see a tale of resilience, of the unbreakable human spirit. It makes them feel safe, but it's a lie. My survival wasn't an act of strength. It was a statistical anomaly, a cosmic error. The real story isn't about the one who lived. It's about the 189 who didn't. The planners, the dreamers, the parents, the children, they all had plans too. I am their curse. I am the one who has to remember them. I am the keeper of the silence that followed the screams. The miracle wasn't that I survived the fall. The miracle was that they were granted a clean, instant end, while I was left behind to fall forever. My new life isn't a celebration. It's a quiet penance, a testimony. I don't live for the future I planned. I live to honor the past that was stolen, and to tell this story not as a miracle, but as a warning, that the line between a normal day and an impossible ending is thinner than you could ever imagine. My story is just one of many, a single voice from the edge of the void. If you want to hear more stories from the people who have been to the brink and back, who can show us what it truly means to survive, subscribe and join us. Their voices deserve to be heard.